At the end of August 1942, Rommel made one last major attempt to break the El Alamein line and recover the freedom of movement that had defined his earlier victories. The place was Halfa, a ridge and area of high ground behind the southern part of the British front, and the stakes were immense. If the Axis could push through the minefields, turn north behind the Eighth Army, and drive toward the coast, the British position might again be threatened from the rear. If the attack failed, Rommel would lose more fuel, vehicles, and experienced men that he could not easily replace. Halfa matters because it was both a battle and a rehearsal. It showed how the Eighth Army, under Montgomery, intended to fight, not by chasing Rommel into his preferred mobile game, but by using ground, artillery, air power, intelligence, mines, and discipline to turn an armored thrust into a costly dead end. If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. The Axis plan followed the logic of earlier desert maneuver. Rommel intended to attack in the south, pass through or around the British minefields, then swing north and east behind the main defensive line. From there, his armored forces could threaten the British rear, disrupt supply, and perhaps force another withdrawal. This was the kind of operation that had frightened British commanders before, because it turned static positions into traps. A defender facing such a move had to decide whether to counterattack, withdraw, or risk being cut off. At El Alamein, however, the battlefield had changed. The Qattara Depression limited the southern flank, and the British had prepared for exactly this kind of move. Rommel was trying to repeat a familiar pattern, but Montgomery intended to deny him the conditions that had once made it work. Halfa Ridge was central because it gave the defenders a strong blocking position behind the southern minefields. A listener should imagine the Axis forces pushing from west to east through difficult lanes, then trying to bend northward, only to find British armor and guns waiting on ground chosen in advance. Montgomery did not plan to send his tanks charging into the open desert to meet Rommel on equal terms. Instead, he positioned them to defend from the ridge and nearby ground, where they could fight in cooperation with anti-tank guns, artillery, and air support. This was a deliberate reversal of earlier British habits. Rather than allowing armored brigades to be lured onto German anti-tank screens, Montgomery used his armor as part of a defensive system designed to stop an enemy advance. The opening of the Axis attack immediately revealed the burden Rommel carried. His forces had to move through minefields and defended approaches under pressure from the air. Minefields did not always destroy large numbers of tanks outright, but they slowed movement, broke rhythm, forced engineers forward, and made columns vulnerable. In armored warfare, delay is not merely inconvenience. Delay burns fuel, exposes vehicles, disrupts timing, and gives the defender time to understand where the blow is falling. Rommel's army was already short of fuel, and every hour spent struggling through obstacles made the operation less likely to achieve surprise or momentum. The Axis advance still moved forward, but it did so into a battlefield whose dangers had been prepared before the first tank crossed the start line. The Desert Air Force played a major role in shaping the battle. Allied aircraft attacked Axis columns, supply vehicles, and movement routes, adding to the strain of mines and distance. Air power did not win Halfa by itself, and it would be wrong to imagine aircraft simply sweeping tanks from the desert. The effect was cumulative. Bombing and strafing disrupted schedules, damaged vehicles, increased fatigue, and made daylight movement more dangerous. It also worsened the fuel problem because delayed or diverted columns consumed precious petrol without gaining decisive ground. For Rommel, who depended on speed and concentration, that was a serious blow. For Montgomery, air pressure was part of the wider design. Make the enemy's attack arrive late, tired, and disorganized, then meet it on prepared ground. British artillery and anti-tank defences added another layer. When Axis units approached the Halfa position, they faced not an isolated tank force, but a connected defence. Guns were sighted to cover likely approaches, artillery could break up concentrations, and armoured units were ordered to avoid reckless pursuit. This restraint was critical. Rommel had often exploited British impatience, encouraging counterattacks that ran into concealed anti-tank guns. At Halfa, Montgomery refused that game. He did not want his armour drawn down from prepared positions into a chase across uncertain ground. The goal was not to produce a spectacular counterstroke for its own sake. The goal was to make the Axis offensive spend itself against a defence that would not be pulled apart. The tank fighting at Halfa, therefore, had a different character from the swirling desert battles of earlier campaigns. British Grant tanks, with their useful firepower but awkward design, and other armoured vehicles, were positioned as part of a line rather than as independent raiders. Axis panzers remained tactically dangerous, and German crews were experienced, but their attack had lost much of the operational freedom that made them most effective. They were facing a defender who knew the likely direction of advance and had prepared to meet it. This is one of the battle's essential lessons. Tanks are not simply tools of movement, they can also be tools of controlled defense when placed on good ground, supported by artillery, protected by mines, and governed by disciplined command decisions. Intelligence and anticipation also shaped the result. The British had a clearer sense than in earlier campaigns of what Rommel might try, helped by signals intelligence, reconnaissance, and a careful reading of the battlefield. That did not mean every Axis move was known in exact detail or that combat became predictable. War never becomes that neat. But foreknowledge in broad outline allowed Montgomery to prepare the southern sector and resist the temptation to overreact. He expected the blow, understood its likely purpose, and had already decided how he wanted his formations to respond. Intelligence mattered because it turned uncertainty into preparation. In a mechanized battle, where hours can decide whether armor breaks through or stalls, knowing where to prepare can be as valuable as another brigade of tanks. Rommel's army, meanwhile, was reaching the limits of what courage and skill could overcome. German and Italian troops had fought an extraordinary advance across the desert, but machines wear down, and supply lines do not obey reputation. Fuel shortages became decisive because an armored thrust without fuel is not a thrust at all. Vehicles needed maintenance, crews needed rest, and the supply columns that sustained the front were vulnerable to air attack and distance. The Axis commander could still make dangerous tactical decisions, but he could not conjure reserves from empty depots. Halfa exposed the material imbalance that would become even more important in October. The Axis could still wound the Eighth Army, but it was becoming harder for them to impose a decision. Montgomery's handling of the battle was not flashy, and that was the point. He chose not to risk the Eighth Army in a dramatic pursuit once the Axis attack faltered. Some critics later saw this as excessive caution, arguing that a more aggressive commander might have destroyed Rommel's forces then and there. That criticism deserves consideration because battlefield opportunities can vanish quickly. Yet Montgomery's caution also reflected the Army's recent history. He had inherited a force that had been punished by hasty armored action and confused exploitation. His priority was to preserve strength, maintain the line, and ensure that Rommel's failed attack did not become a British failure through overextension. In the context of August 1942, restraint was not weakness. It was a command decision shaped by hard experience. The failed Axis attack had psychological consequences as well as tactical ones. Rommel had advanced into Egypt as the commander who seemed always able to find a flank, create a crisis, and force the British backward. At Halfa, he tried to do that and failed. The Eighth Army held its ground, British armor did not rush blindly into traps, and Allied air and artillery power helped blunt the attack. For the soldiers defending El Alamein, this mattered. The army had not merely survived behind a line, it had faced Rommel's chosen method and denied it. Confidence built from such an experience is different from confidence built from speeches. It comes from seeing the enemy attack, seeing the system hold, and realizing that the old pattern may no longer apply. Alam Halfa also served as a preview of the coming October battle by showing what would be essential on a larger scale. Mines shaped movement. Engineers and route control mattered. Artillery and anti-tank guns worked with armor rather than separately from it. Air power attacked the enemy's ability to move and supply itself. Intelligence helped the commander prepare instead of merely react. Logistics determined how long an army could sustain pressure. These were the same themes that would define Second El Alamein, though in October the Eighth Army would be attacking rather than defending. Alam Halfa was therefore not a side episode. It was the moment when Montgomery's method passed its first major test, and Rommel's operational method met a prepared answer. For the history of armored warfare, Alam Halfa marks the decline of the old desert pattern in which speed and nerve could repeatedly compensate for weak supply. Rommel remained a skilled and dangerous opponent, but his army had been forced into a narrowing corridor and then denied the decisive flank maneuver he needed. Montgomery showed that tanks could be used effectively without indulging in a reckless chase, and that a mechanized defense could be built from mines, guns, armor, aircraft, and command discipline. The battle did not destroy the Axis army, and it did not end the campaign. What it did was transfer initiative. After Alam Halfa, Rommel no longer held the same freedom to dictate events. The Eighth Army had absorbed his last major lunge toward Egypt and could now prepare its own offensive. The guns did not fall silent after Alam Halfa, and the desert did not suddenly become safe. Men still lived under air attack, shell fire, heat, sickness, and uncertainty. But the strategic mood had changed. Rommel had spent scarce fuel and strength trying to unlock the El Alamein position, and the lock had held. Montgomery had shown his army that discipline, preparation, and restraint could beat speed when the ground and timing were chosen well. The battle was not the famous climax, yet it made the climax possible. Alam Halfa gave the Eighth Army proof that it could stand against Rommel's mobile warfare and survive. In the weeks that followed, that proof would be turned into preparation for something larger. Not merely another defense of Egypt, but a deliberate offensive designed to break the Axis line and begin driving it west.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.